when I bring up the subject of Tolkien's Uncanny, probably what leaps to mind are all the scary moments in The Lord of the Rings. The first encounters with the Black Riders, the attack on Weathertop, the darkness of Moria, and the appearance of the Balrog, and of course Sam and Frodo's encounter with Shelob, to name just a few. But scary and uncanny, while having some overlap, don't mean the same thing. The uncanny is more eerie than terrifying, more unsettling than frightening. In this respect, the English word uncanny is actually less useful than the German. Unheimlich literally translates as unhomely, the opposite of heimlich, homely, which means intimate, friendly, comfortable, the enjoyment of quiet content, and arousing a sense of agreeable restfulness and security. To experience the unheimlich, then, is to not be at home, to be possibly exposed and unsettled. The uncannily as unhomely is an understanding derived from Sigmund Freud. When I first read his essay The Uncanny in the course of my undergraduate years, Freud's explication of the term made something I'd never quite understood in Tolkien make sense. During my first readings of Lord of the Rings, I remember thinking it odd that Rivendell was known as the last homely house. Homely did not seem an appropriate word to me, as I understood it in today's more common usage, namely, plain and unattractive, neither of which are descriptors that apply to the House of Elrond. Rivendell, indeed, is the antithesis of plain and unattractive. So, in my mind, I tended to delete the L, but even the last homey house still didn't quite cut it. Rivendell is more than merely homey. It was an odd little detail my mind bumped against, but not so much I dwelt on it overmuch. It was only many years later, when I read Freud's essay, that Tolkien's use of the word homely started to make perfect sense. In our previous video, I suggested that magic in Middle-earth often manifests in place, with different locations assuming the relative power and nature of their inhabitants. I want to expand on that discussion here, but with a focus on Tolkien's uses of the uncanny. At first glance, that might seem an odd choice. Didn't I just get done explaining how the uncanny is precisely the opposite of the comfort and security and magic of home? Well, yes, and no. And that's where it gets interesting. Freud's essay is useful to us in part because he argues that when we define unheimlich or uncanny as merely eerie, we're missing half the meaning. Heimlich is of the house, or home, friendly, familiar, intimate, comfortable. Also secure, domestic, and domesticated, and hospitable. But the second related meaning connotes secrecy. Heimlich means concealed, hidden, or private. The Oxford English Dictionary notes that in several cognate Germanic languages, the parallel adjective shows a semantic development from private to secret, clandestine, or mysterious. Thus, unheimlich, as the negation, entails being not of the house, unfriendly, unfamiliar, discomforting, unsecure, inhospitable. But by the same token, it is also unconcealed, unsecret, that which is made known, that which is supposed to be kept secret, but is revealed, perhaps inadvertently. It's the second half of these definitions that makes the uncanny a particularly fascinating and particularly useful term. We see in the simultaneous meanings of intimate and comfortable on one hand, and concealed and secret on the other, an obvious continuity. Secrecy is consonant with privacy, and privacy is one of the qualities we associate with the home. But at the same time, there potentially lurks sinister subtext, as the secrecy of the home can also conceal a host of abuses, of violent acts, of indiscretions and transgressions past and present. In Gothic horror, after all, it is most often houses that are haunted by revenants of pain and trauma, and such stories usually entail the revelation of those old secrets. But you might be asking, what does this have to do with Tolkien? Well, quite a lot, I want to suggest. We should note first that, though Tolkien, on one hand, had no particular use for Freud and his psychoanalytic theories, he would have been intimately familiar with the nuances of Heimlich and Unheimlich. His first scholarly job was as an editor on the Oxford English Dictionary, and his area of expertise was with Nordic and Germanic languages. So, calling Rivendell the last homely house wasn't accidental, and this is something we can further discern from the fact that in the first draft of The Hobbit, he has Gandalf call it the last decent house. which after a few pages he changes to homely, making a marginal note to go back and change all the prior uses of decent. We get a deeper understanding of Rivendell's magic in the Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf makes clear to Frodo that it is one of the few places in Middle-earth with the power to resist the might of Mordor, albeit just for a while. But where in the Fellowship of the Ring Frodo wakes up in Rivendell, Bilbo and the dwarves have a decidedly difficult time finding the place in the Hobbit, even with Gandalf acting as their guide. While the way to Rivendell isn't hidden per se in The Lord of the Rings, there is nevertheless a powerful sense of the place's secrecy. It is hidden, not from our heroes, but from the eye of Sauron. The most significant exemplar of the hidden and secret in Rivendell is only revealed in the final pages of The Return of the King, when we see Elrond openly wearing one of the 3 elven rings. Elrond wore a mantle of grey, and had a star upon his forehead, and a silver harp was in his hand. And upon his finger was a ring of gold with a great blue stone, Vilya, the mightiest of the 3. In this moment we also see that Galadriel wears Nenya, the ring of Mithril, which Frodo, and by extension us the readers, already know. More on this in a moment. And then we learn Gandalf wears the 3rd, Narya. Now, without getting too much into the history of the Rings of Power, it's worth noting how much of it is about secrecy, hiding, and revelation. The precipitating action of The Lord of the Rings is Gandalf's suspicion, and then realization that this little magic ring Bilbo accidentally stole from Gollum is actually the one ring to rule them all. Even before he confirms this fact, he enjoins Frodo to keep it safe and keep it secret. In The Hobbit, the ring itself functions as a means of hiding oneself. Bilbo, brought on the dwarves' quest in the unlikely capacity of a burglar, provides surprisingly adept in that role, not least because he can make himself invisible with the ring. Like much in The Hobbit that carries over into The Lord of the ring's power of invisibility becomes somewhat more complicated. Bilbo's use of the ring is quite simple and straightforward, and indeed during the dwarves' captivity in the halls of the Elven King, Bilbo remains invisible for days at a time with no ill effects. But the wearing of the ring in The Lord of the Rings is rather more problematic. Though the wearer becomes invisible to other corporeal mortals, they become visible to the spirit realm. In the fateful moment on Weathertop, when Frodo puts on the ring, the advancing Nazgul becomes suddenly, startlingly clear. Immediately, though everything else remained as before, dim and dark, the shapes became terribly clear. He was able to see beneath their black wrappings. They were 5 tall figures. In their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long grey robes. Upon their grey hairs were helms of silver. In their haggard hands were swords of steel. What was visible, Frodo, becomes invisible. What was invisible, the ringwraiths, becomes visible. What's more, Frodo becomes visible to them. As Gandalf gravely notes when Frodo wakes up in Rivendell, "You were at your gravest peril when you wore the ring, for you were halfway in the Wraith world yourself, and they might have seized you. You could see them, and they could see you." The Nazgul stab Frodo with a knife, whose tip breaks off and burrows deeper. If the shard were to reach his heart, he would himself become a wraith. As they approach Rivendell, the corporeal world fades around him, while other things become visible. When he crosses the river and looks back, he can now see the Nazgul as he did when he wore the ring. They appeared to have cast aside their hoods and black cloaks, and they were robed in white and grey. Swords were naked in their pale hands, helms were on their heads. With his last failing senses, Frodo heard cries, and it seemed to him that he saw, beyond the riders that hesitated on the shore, a shining figure of white light, and behind it ran small shadowy forms waving flames that flared red in the grey mist that was falling over the world. Later, when he asks Gandalf if the shining figure was the elf Glorfindel, Gandalf replies, "Yes, you saw him as he is upon the other side, one of the mighty of the firstborn." This invisible, visible, hidden, revealed opposition pervades The Lord of the Rings. This is where magic lives. Tolkien's elves, especially those high elves more closely related to the godlike Valar, are themselves uncanny, both in the magical sense and the ways they excite both wonder and suspicion among mortals in equal measure. Sam sums this seeming contradiction up nicely. "They seem to be a bit above my likes and dislikes, so to speak," Sam says to Frodo. "It don't seem to matter what I think about them. They are quite different from what I expected. so old and young, so gay and sad. As usual, Samwise Gamgee is at once our proxy as readers in experiencing the magic of Middle-earth, and the voice of wisdom, cloaking key truths of the story in his rough-spun language. But he gets at a key dimension of elves, who are simultaneously old and young, joyful and mournful, and profoundly other than mortals. And though Sam is the open-minded type who sees the beauty and wonder of elves, there are more than a few times when mortals exhibit fear and distrust that are the flip side of Sam's delight. We encounter this dislocation most strikingly in Lothlorien. Though Elrond opens the last homely house to all free folk of good hearts, the elves of Lothlorien have long been more insular and guarded, which has in turn made the neighboring men of Rohan and Gondor fearful. As the Fellowship approaches Lothlorien, Boromir expresses reluctance. "Is there no other way?" he demands. "Of that perilous land we have heard in Gondor, and it is said that few come out who once go in, and of that few none have escaped unscathed." Aragorn corrects Boromir on the details, but not in the spirit of his concern, saying unscathed is the wrong word to use. But if you say unchanged, then maybe you will speak the truth. And when Boromir reluctantly agrees to proceed, but warns that Lothlorien is perilous, Aragorn agrees with another modification. "Fair and perilous," he amends, which is a reasonable approximation of the meaning of sublime, not merely beautiful, but awe-inspiring to the point of fear, transfiguring in a spiritual manner. The Fellowship's respite in Lothlorien, while recuperative, is also uncanny and transformative. None depart unchanged, both positively and negatively. At one end of the scale, Gimli and Legolas forge a bromance for the ages. At the other, Boromir's nascent desire for the ring burrows deeper in his heart. And Frodo and Sam have an encounter with elf magic, which itself proves to be about revelation and making the invisible visible. Their glimpse into the mirror of Galadriel is anticipated by Galadriel's test of the Fellowship. She held them with her eyes, and in silence looked searchingly at each of them in turn. None save Legolas and Aragorn could long endure her glance. Later, they all share that each had felt that he was being offered a choice between a shadow full of fear that lay ahead and something that he greatly desired, if just he would abandon the quest. We find in Galadriel's test the epitome of the uncanny in this fraught tension between secrecy and revelation. Never mind the deeply disconcerting experience of having a beautiful and terrifying elven queen read your thoughts. Galadriel's test is about revealing your own secrets to yourself, of making your own mind unhomely. She later offers Frodo and Sam more possible revelations when she invites them to look into her mirror, a shallow basin of water. "What shall we see?" Frodo asks. "Many things I can command the mirror to reveal," she answered, "and so some I can show what they desire to see. But the mirror will also show things unbidden, and those are often stranger and more profitable than things which we wish to behold." Turning to Sam, she notes that, "This is what your folk would call magic. Did you not say that you wished to see elf magic?" Looking into the mirror, Sam and Frodo see a jumble of bewildering scenes, many of which only become comprehensible in hindsight. And then Frodo sees the eye of Sauron, searching this way and that, and Frodo knew with certainty and horror that among the many things that it sought, he himself was one, but he also knew that it could not see him, not yet, not unless he willed it. When, shaking all over, Frodo steps away from the mirror, he looks at Galadriel and sees a ring about her finger, which glittered like polished gold, overlaid with a silver light, and a white stone in it twinkled as if the Evenstar had come down to rest upon her hand. In this moment, Frodo sees that Galadriel wears one of the 3 elven rings. "It is not permitted to speak of it," she tells Frodo, "but it cannot be hidden from the ring-bearer, and one who has seen the eye." The eye of Sauron is uncanny in the most basic sense of the word, but is itself quite obviously a metaphor for the seen and unseen. The entire quest, indeed, hinges on Frodo and the Fellowship hewing to Gandalf's directive to keep it safe and keep it secret. To keep it, in other words, heimlich, or homely. There is something of an irony that the moment of revelation at the end, when Frodo puts on the ring well in Mount Doom, this moment is a profoundly unheimlich moment for the Dark Lord. It is both the disconcerting unveiling of a secret, and it prefaces Sauron's imminent unhoming. We'll almost certainly have more to say in the future about Tolkien's magic. It's a fascinating subject precisely because he doesn't explicate it much at all. But if, as we pointed out in our last video, home is a concept that he imbues with magic, it makes sense that the unhomely has a magic of its own.